After studying this module, you shall be able to know about goods and money market equilibrium in an open economy. Learn more about balance of payments, exchange rate regimes and capital mobility. Learn about the Mundell-Fleming model. Understand the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policies in a fixed exchange rate regime. Analyze the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policies with flexible exchange rates. In this module, we will discuss how the introduction of the assumption of an open economy modifies the ISLM model. When we have a closed economy, the aggregate demand by domestic residents is equal to consumption expenditure, investment expenditure and the government expenditure. Thus, the domestic spending depends on interest rate, that is I, and income, that is Y. Since investment is a function of I, while consumption is determined by the level of disposable income, so A, which is a function of Y and I, is equal to C plus I plus G. As we saw in the previous modules, in an open economy, we include trade with the rest of the world. So, domestic residents spend on foreign goods and foreigners buy domestic goods. Thus, exports and imports of goods come into the picture. In an open economy, there is equilibrium in the goods market when the demand for domestically produced goods by the domestic residents and foreigners is equal to aggregate supply of goods consisting of total output produced in the economy and the imports. In an open economy, when we talk about spending on domestic goods, then we need to add total exports, then deduct the total imports. That is, Y is equal to spending on domestic goods, which is equal to C plus G plus X minus M, or Y plus M is equal to C plus I plus G plus X. Total exports depend on foreign income and the real exchange rate. So, when foreign income increases or domestic currency depreciates, this leads to an increase in total exports, whereas total imports depend on domestic income and the real exchange rate. As domestic income increases, or if there is appreciation of domestic currency, this will lead to an increase in total imports. That is, X, which is a function of YF, that is foreign income, and R, that is real exchange rate, and M is a function of Y and R. So, net exports, which is the difference between total exports and total imports, is a function of domestic income, foreign income and the real exchange rate. So, aggregate demand in an open economy is Y is equal to AYI plus NX, Y, YF and R, where NX is equal to X, YF and R minus M, Y and R. Thus, if there is an increase in foreign income or depreciation of domestic currency, this will lead to increase in aggregate demand. But an increase in domestic income will increase total imports, and thus this will make the trade balance worse off. The IS curve, which indicates equilibrium in goods market, shows equality between aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So, Y is equal to AYR plus NX, Y, YF and R. Thus, we can conclude that if there is an increase in foreign income or real depreciation, this will lead to a rightward shift in IS curve. As in case of closed economy, macroeconomic equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the IS and LM curves. We will now discuss the role of capital flows affecting the rate of interest in an open economy. Balance of payments, exchange rate and capital flows. An economy is linked to the international market through trade and finance. In this module, we will analyze the modifications to the ISLM model after taking into consideration the linkages and implications of international trade and finance. For this, first we need to introduce the concept of balance of payments and exchange rates. You may recall from our discussion in the earlier modules that balance of payment is a systematic record of all the transactions done by a country with the rest of the world. It consists of two accounts, one is current account and another is capital account. Current account records broadly three sets of transactions: the transaction in goods and services, investment income, that is interest and dividends, and the unilateral transfers. Transfer payments include workers' remittances, gifts and grants. So, current account balance consists of net exports, net invisibles and net transfers from abroad. The capital account record transactions in assets. When receipts from foreigners are more than payments made to them, the country has a net capital inflow. If a country has a deficit in its current account, then the deficits need to be financed. This can be done by selling assets or by borrowing, which means that there is a corresponding surplus in the capital account. The capital account includes transactions made by private and government agents as well as official reserve transactions. So, the current account deficit is either financed by net capital inflows on account of the private sector or the government sector or both. Official reserve transactions involve depletion on accumulation of reserves of foreign exchange held by the central bank. When the current account is in deficit and the capital account is in surplus, there could be a balance of payment surplus if the size of the surplus exceeds that of the deficit. In case of current account deficit exceeds the capital account surplus, there is a balance of payment deficit. In case both current and capital account are in deficit, then the central bank depletes its foreign exchange reserves. Now we will analyze the impact of monetary and fiscal policies under different exchange rate regimes. But first we will briefly revise our concepts relating to different exchange rate regimes. We will define a country's exchange rate as number of units in domestic currency required to buy 1 unit of foreign currency, which indicates the price of foreign currency in terms of home currency. For example, when the dollar-rupee exchange rate is 60, it means 60 rupees can be used to buy $1 in foreign exchange market. This is defined as the nominal exchange rate. But when we measure the amount of domestic goods which is to be given up to get 1 unit of foreign good, it is known as real exchange rate. This concept was discussed in the previous module where we saw the real exchange rate is the ratio of foreign to domestic prices expressed in terms of domestic currency. The exchange rate regimes can be divided into two types. The first one is fixed exchange rate system, second is flexible exchange rate system. In fixed exchange rate system, the central bank fixes the value of exchange rate, and in flexible exchange rate system, the exchange rate is determined by demand and supply of foreign currency. With a fully flexible exchange rate system, the central bank does not interfere at all in the process of determination of exchange rate. While under flexible exchange rate, the demand for and supply of foreign currencies are equated through movements in exchange rates. Under clean floating, the central bank does not interfere at all and the balance of payments balance is always zero, with balance of payment equilibrium achieved via exchange rate fluctuations. But many times the central bank does interfere in a flexible exchange rate system, trying to influence the value of the exchange rate, and this is known as a system of dirty floating. With globalization, there is more and more integration of international markets, and this module assumes that there is perfect capital mobility, which implies that when the domestic interest rate I is more than the world rate of interest, that is IW, there is unlimited foreign capital inflow into the economy. When the domestic rate of interest is lower, then unlimited capital outflow takes place. Thus, the capital account balance depends on the interest differential between domestic and world rates of interest. The balance of payment surplus has two components. First one is trade surplus, second one is capital account surplus. Thus, we can write the equation for balance of payment surplus as balance of payment is equal to NX, Y, YF, R and CF, that is the difference of I and IW. Note, we can just add net factor payments from abroad to the trade surplus to obtain the current account surplus. Thus, the balance of payment surplus depends on following domestic income, foreign income, exchange rate and the interest rate differential, that is difference between domestic rate of interest and world rate of interest. So, when we have trade deficit, then that has to be financed by a capital inflow to have balance of payment equilibrium. When the balance of payment is zero, or we say we have external balance, in the graph the horizontal axis show domestic output and the vertical axis show the interest rate. The balance of payment is equal to zero line is parallel to the x-axis. Due to the assumption of perfect capital mobility, when the domestic and world interest rate are same, we have external balance. When the domestic interest is more than the world rate of interest, then there will be unlimited capital inflow and there will be surplus in the balance of payments. On the other hand, if domestic interest rate is less than the world interest rate, there will be unlimited outflow. When both domestic and world rates of interest are equal, that is balance of payment is equal to 0 and the line is parallel to the x-axis, points above this line indicate surplus and below this indicate deficit in balance of payment situation. We will extend the analysis of output termination to the open economy with perfect capital mobility under different exchange rate regimes. Open economy, ISLM model, that is Mundell-Fleming model. Robert Mundell and Marcus Fleming have extended the ISLM model to the open economy under perfect capital mobility, and thus this analysis is well known as Mundell-Fleming model. Throughout this analysis, we will assume that aggregate prices are held constant, the standard assumption in the ISL framework. So, let us first discuss about fixed exchange rate regime, and in this we can first discuss the effectiveness of monetary policy. We can see in figure 2.1 that the initial equilibrium is at E, at the intersection of the ISLM schedules. At this point, external balance or balance of payment equilibrium is shown by the horizontal line, that is BP is equal to 0 line, where there is equality between domestic and world rate of interest. Now let us assume we have monetary expansion. This will lead to a rightward shift in LM and new equilibrium is at E1. At this point, the domestic rate of interest is lower than the world rate, that is I is less than IW. So, this sets off a capital outflow from the economy and will lead to a balance of payment deficit. This deficit puts pressure on the exchange rate to depreciate, but since the economy is under fixed exchange rate, the central bank will intervene and will sell foreign exchange and buy rupee. This will lead to a reduction in domestic money supply and will shift LM curve towards the left. This process will continue till the original equilibrium E is reached. We will learn more about the role of foreign exchange reserves and its impact on the money supply in one of the later modules. Now we can discuss the impact of monetary contraction with perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rates. When the economy has a fixed exchange rate regime and perfect capital mobility, the central bank cannot set the interest rate at a level that is different from the world rate of interest. Let us see the effect of monetary contraction under perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rate. Suppose the central bank wants to increase the rate of interest in the economy and reduce the money supply. When the rate of interest is more than the world rate, this will lead to infinite capital inflows and would result in a surplus in the balance of payments of the economy. Because of the surplus, domestic currency would tend to appreciate. However, since the exchange rate is fixed, the central bank would intervene to hold the exchange rate constant, and it would buy up foreign exchange and sell rupee. This action would lead to an increase in stock of domestic currency, which would restore the interest rate to the world level. Let us see this process graphically. In this figure, we have the IS, LM and balance of payment equal to 0 schedules. The balance of payment is equal to 0 line is parallel to the horizontal axis in the economy with perfect capital mobility. When domestic rate of interest is equal to the world rate of interest, or in other words, when I is equal to IW, IS and LM intersect at E, which shows the initial equilibrium. Then there is monetary contraction and the LM curve shifts towards the left and the economy moves to E1. At E1, the domestic rate of interest rate is higher than the world rate, so there will be capital inflow. This will further create pressures for appreciation of the domestic currency. But since the economy is under fixed exchange rate regime, the central bank will intervene and buy foreign exchange, leading to an increase in domestic money supply. As a result, the LM will shift downward and this process will continue till the initial equilibrium is reached. So we can conclude that when we have perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rates, then monetary policy is ineffective. This was demonstrated in both cases above, where a change in monetary policy had no impact either on output or interest rates. Further, in order to maintain exchange rate parity, money supply had to adjust so as to hold domestic interest rates equal to the world rate of interest under conditions of perfect capital mobility. Effectiveness of fiscal policy. First, impact of fiscal expansion with perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rates. From this graph, you can see the initial equilibrium is at E. When we say there is fiscal expansion, it implies either a cut in tax rate or an increase in government expenditure. You may recall from our discussion in the previous modules, if there is an increase in government expenditure or a cut in tax rate, this will lead to an increase in aggregate demand and shift the IS curve towards the right. This rightward shift will bring the economy to E1. At E1, since the domestic interest rate is more than the world rate, that is I is greater than IW, this will lead to capital inflow and will put pressure on exchange rate to appreciate. But because of fixed exchange rate, the central bank will intervene and buy foreign exchange. This will lead to an increase in the stock of domestic currency. This increase in money stock will lead to rightward shift in LM till domestic and world interest rates are equal. As you can see from this diagram, that the new equilibrium is at E2, where I is just equal to IW. The output has further increased to OY2, the level that is attained when there is absolutely no crowding out. Now we can have a look on impact of fiscal contraction with perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rates. With a given money supply and initial equilibrium at E, a fiscal contraction will lead to a leftward shift of the IS curve so that the economy is at E1. But at this point, the rate of interest is below the word rate of interest, that is I is less than IW. So this will lead to capital outflow and depreciation of domestic currency. But since the economy has adopted a fixed exchange rate system, the central bank will reduce the money supply by selling foreign exchange. This reduction in money supply will shift the LM towards left, and the new equilibrium will be at E2, where IS1 and LM1 intersect and domestic and world interest rates are equal, that is I is equal to IW. In this process, the trade balance situation will improve, but the new equilibrium output would be below the original level. From this discussion, we can conclude that the fiscal policy is very effective under perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rate, as this leads to output expansion when there is a fiscal expansion. Further, there is no crowding out owing to the endogenous expansion of money supply that occurs to maintain the exchange rate parity under the system of fixed exchange rates, a flexible exchange rate regime. The effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policies with perfect capital mobility and flexible exchange rates. When the economy has a fully flexible exchange rate regime, the central bank does not intervene in the foreign exchange market, and there is no automatic link between the balance of payments and money supply, as the central bank does not need to maintain foreign exchange reserves for intervening in currency markets. The effectiveness of monetary policy, impact of monetary expansion with perfect capital mobility and flexible exchange rate. We can see from the graph that the initial equilibrium is at E, where IS and LM curve intersect. Now let us assume there is an increase in the nominal stock of money. As discussed in the last module, this will lead to a shift in LM curve towards right, and the economy will be at E1. As you can see here, the domestic rate of interest is below the world rate of interest, that is I is less than IW. This will lead to capital outflow and depreciation of the domestic currency. As you may recall from our discussion in the previous module, a currency depreciation leads to an improvement in the trade balance, assuming the Marshall-Lerner condition holds. So, this improvement will shift the IS curve to IS1, and the final equilibrium will be at E2, where IS1 and LM1 intersect. So, we can conclude that when there is a monetary expansion, there is improvement in the trade balance and the output level increases. Impact of monetary contraction with perfect capital mobility and flexible exchange rates. In this graph, let us assume there is a reduction in nominal money stock. This will lead to a shift in the LM curve towards left to LM1. From this graph, you can see that the domestic interest rate is more than the world rate of interest, that is I is greater than IW. So, there will be capital inflow, and this will lead to an appreciation in the exchange rate. This appreciation will make the trade balance worse, and because of this, the IS will shift towards the left, that is to IS1. So, finally, the equilibrium will be at E2 at the intersection of IS1 and LM1. Thus, we can conclude that when there is monetary contraction, this will lead to a decrease in output and reduction in net exports as there is appreciation of domestic currency. Effectiveness of fiscal policy, impact of fiscal expansion with perfect capital mobility and flexible exchange rate. This graph shows the initial equilibrium at E. Then we have fiscal expansion, which shifts the IS curve towards the right. This rightward shift brings the economy to E1. At this point, the domestic interest rate will be more than the world interest rate, so there will be capital inflows that would lead to appreciation of the domestic currency. This appreciation would reduce net exports, which is one of the components of aggregate demand, leading to a shift in IS curve towards the left. Finally, the equilibrium is achieved at the initial level, that is E. So, you can see that in this case, despite the expansionary fiscal policy, output will come back to the original level, while the trade balance would worsen because of the appreciation in the exchange rate. Impact of fiscal contraction with perfect capital mobility and flexible exchange rates. Let us assume there is a cut in government expenditure, then this fiscal contraction will lead to a shift in the IS towards the left and the economy will be at E1. At this point, since domestic rate of interest is lower than world rate of interest, that is I is less than IW, this will lead to capital outflow and currency depreciation. Depreciation in the exchange rate will improve the trade balance and this will shift the IS curve from IS1 back to the original level. So we can conclude that when there is fiscal contraction, there is no change in output as the economy finally moves back to the original level, and there is improvement in trade balance because of currency depreciation, assuming the Marshall-Lerner condition holds. From this discussion, we can conclude that under fixed exchange rates and with perfect capital mobility, monetary policy is ineffective, but fiscal policy is quite effective. But under a system of flexible exchange rates with perfect mobility, it is the other way around, that is fiscal policy is ineffective, but monetary policy is very effective. Let us summarize this module. We have seen that an open economy experiences both international trade and capital flows. Open economies may experience either a current account deficit or surplus. Current account deficits are financed either by a capital account surplus or by drawing down foreign exchange reserves. With perfect capital mobility, the domestic interest rate must be equal to the interest rate in rest of the world. Otherwise, the economy would experience either continuous capital outflows if domestic interest rates are lower than the world rates, or inflows if domestic rates were higher. With fixed exchange rates, the central bank announces a fixed parity and uses foreign exchange reserves to maintain the exchange rate parity. With fixed exchange rates and perfect capital mobility, money supply becomes endogenous and monetary policy becomes ineffective, while fiscal policy is very effective and there is no crowding out effect. With fully flexible exchange rates, the value of the currency is determined entirely by demand and supply of foreign exchange. With flexible exchange rates and perfect capital mobility, monetary policy is very effective, but fiscal policy loses its effectiveness.